Hey guys, Nintendrew here. Nintendo 64 gamers are not short on controller options. At least to me, it seems like the 64 had more third-party controllers than any console that came before or after it. And whether you're a competitive Smash player or just looking for the best option for casual play, you've gotta have the right controller for the job. Well, look no further. For this video, I've thoroughly tested 5 of my favorite N64 gamepads and put them through a gauntlet of challenges to determine which of them deserves a spot in your setup. So, let's get to it. Alright, so like I mentioned, I've got 5 controllers to get through today, and we're just going to run through some pros and cons of each so that you guys can make your own assessments along with me. First up, as kind of a bit of a baseline, let's take a look at the original first-party Nintendo 64 controller. This controller is great for that nostalgia factor. You can't get more authentic than the original, but of course it has its own problems, which it makes sense, otherwise I wouldn't be making this video about alternatives. So for the positives, this might seem kind of obvious, but every Nintendo 64 game was built with this controller in mind, so if you have a controller in great condition, you're gonna have perfect input every time. On the flip side, the design of this controller is a pretty big point of contention. Some people just really do not like the 3-prong design. Personally, I like this layout and I think it was kind of novel for the time, but I can definitely understand those of you who would prefer a more standard controller layout. But perhaps a much bigger issue is that the joysticks on these controllers are very prone to failure. Underneath this housing is a mechanism which basically just has plastic rubbing against plastic, so inevitably over the years and through hours of use, this joystick is going to become loose and unresponsive. Now what you're seeing on the screen here is an input test program which I am running on real Nintendo 64 hardware through an EverDrive. And basically this is just meant to test any controller against the original first-party controller fresh out of the box. As you can see, the controller that I decided to test in this case is suffering a bit from that loose joystick, and you can tell the analog stick inputs aren't quite as sensitive as they should be. So if you have one of these controllers with a bit of wear and tear on it, you might have some problems like running at full speed and that sort of thing. Of course, there are plenty of options on the market for replacement joysticks if you'd like to get your hands dirty and replace it yourself, but that's not really the point of this video. I'm just kind of taking each controller at face value. So that's about it for the original first-party gamepad. Next up, we've got the Hori Pad Mini, and the first thing you'll probably notice about this one is its nice, familiar layout, which is much closer to a standard controller. But personally, my favorite thing about this controller is its joystick. This joystick is quite a bit larger than the original and more closely resembles a GameCube joystick. But more importantly, it is very springy and responsive, and it has super low resistance. It feels like you can move this thing with a feather. It's very hard to explain without being able to show it to you directly, but just trust me, this is an excellent joystick. Now, one big downside to this one is it's got kind of a small build. You can tell it's a lot smaller than some other similar controllers, and it's not very well suited to those of us with larger hands. It's kind of cramped here. In addition, after running it through my input test program, I found that the Hori Pad Mini actually has a slightly higher sensitivity than the original controller. But in practice, at least to me, it seems that it doesn't really affect gameplay at all. It just means that you're going to get to that maximum input just slightly before you reach the edge of that controller's movement distance. The biggest downside to the Hori Pad Mini in my mind is that it is somewhat rare and hard to come by, meaning it can get pretty pricey. Your best option for getting one of these is to order it from overseas on a site like eBay, where they can go for upwards of $100. So it's certainly going to be out of many gamers' price range and might not necessarily be worth it for those extra features. Next up, we've got the Brawler 64 controller, and this one is much newer. This one actually just came out this year from a company called Retro Fighters. The first thing you'll notice about this controller is that it has an excellent layout and design, much closer to a modern controller even than the Hori Pad Mini. Additionally, this controller has a much improved joystick. I wouldn't say I like it quite as much as the Hori Pad Minis, but it is certainly a massive upgrade from the original controller. All of the buttons feel great. It has that same familiar aesthetic from the original, and it's just much closer to what you would expect from a current-gen gamepad. That being said, there are of course a couple of caveats with this controller as well, and one of my big issues with this controller is that it has an irregular analog gate. So if you don't know what that means, the analog gate refers to this piece of plastic surrounding the analog stick which kind of directs the stick, and in the case of the 64, allows you to easily input in the 4 cardinal directions as well as each of the diagonals. So in the case of the original controller, the analog gate looks something like this. It's shaped like an octagon with 8 sides, but each of the individual points are not actually equidistant from the center. The diagonal directions are actually a little bit farther out, making the shape a little bit closer to a square. In the case of the Brawler 64 gamepad, Retro Fighters actually went with a perfect octagon for their analog gate, meaning that the diagonal directions are actually a little bit closer to the center of the stick. Now, when I first noticed this, I was a little bit worried that, for example, you might run a little bit slower in Super Mario 64 if you were to hold a diagonal direction than you would if you were to use the original controller. But after running the Brawler 64 through the test input program, it became clear that the diagonal directions are at least as sensitive as the original controller, and effectively the only difference that this new analog gate has on gameplay is that the 4 cardinal directions are just a little bit more sensitive than you might expect. All that being said, for what it's worth, I think the Brawler 64 is the best Nintendo 64 controller for me personally. I certainly don't claim to be a competitive player, and the issue of having a somewhat different analog sensitivity and gate don't really affect my everyday use. So at this point, I've covered what I consider to be the best options on the market. But for the sake of being thorough, I also tested a couple of my runner-ups that you might be wondering about. So next up, I've got a Circa aftermarket controller. These are meant to be a direct copy and cheaper alternative to the original. Again, if you're just looking for that original feel, these are great for that nostalgia factor, and at least out of the box, you're not going to have that loose joystick problem. However, it does suffer the same issues as the original controller, namely that it has that same plastic against plastic mechanism, and you can bet after a few years this thing is going to have a loose, unresponsive joystick. Additionally, I ran this one through my test program and found that these controllers tend to have wildly inconsistent analog values and high sensitivity, much more so than the other controllers I've covered so far. Now, this controller could still be a viable option if you're just trying to get a bunch of cheap controllers together for a Mario Party night or something like that, but if you're looking for authentic input, you're going to have to look elsewhere. And finally, the last controller I have to cover today is a bit of a wild card here. This is the Retro-Bit Hyper Mode controller, and the big difference for this guy is that it has the unparalleled convenience of a wireless connection. It's kind of the 64's equivalent of the GameCube's Wavebird controller. Basically, it has this little wireless receiver which you plug into the console itself, and the controller has a battery pack inserted where typically the memory pack would go, which is kind of a cool design. Again, the design is very close to the original controller, which could be a pro or a con depending on your stance on that 3-pronged design. But after running it through the same tests, I found a clear problem with this controller's input. This one has a highly increased analog sensitivity, even more so than the previous controller, meaning that the smallest movement on this stick is going to cause a big response in-game. I also found through testing that this controller's wireless convenience also comes with its own issue in the form of a low update rate, referring to not only just an input lag, but also an issue of input stuttering, meaning that when I was moving the analog stick around, I would notice that sometimes it would take a little longer than you might expect for it to update when I change directions, that sort of thing. And one final problem with this controller is that, much like the Hori Pad Mini, it is very hard to come by. For this video, I tried to find a listing of this controller on eBay or anywhere that I could put into the description below, and I couldn't find one. It seems like these controllers are just, they've fallen off the face of the earth. Now, in case you've forgotten, I still like this controller. It's on my list of favorites. I still enjoy the convenience of having that wireless connection, and for games which don't really rely on low sensitivity, it'll work just fine. So if you manage to come across one for a good price, I would recommend you pick it up, but otherwise, it's not your best choice. So now that we've run through the pros and cons of each controller, I'm gonna run back and just kind of give some final thoughts. The original first-party Nintendo 64 controller is great for nostalgia. You can't get more authentic than the original, but its joystick is prone to failure, so unless you have a controller in great condition, you're gonna have some issues. The Circa aftermarket controller is a cheap alternative to the original at the price of having much poorer and inconsistent input, and is not very suited for competitive play. The Retro-Bit Hypermode wireless controller is also great for nostalgia and has unparalleled convenience with its wireless connection, but that brings along with it some big downsides. It has less than perfect input and highly increased analog sensitivity, and they're nearly impossible to find regardless. The Hori Pad Mini is a great compromise between comfort and authenticity. It may be a little bit too pricey for a casual gamer, but it is a great option for competitive players and hardcore collectors. And finally, the Brawler 64 has a wonderful modern design, at the cost of less than perfect input emulation. For casual play, I can't recommend it enough, and for those competitive players which can adapt to or are not concerned by a small difference in sensitivity, the pros will definitely outweigh the cons. So that's about it. I hope I've given you enough information from my experience to help inform your choice when looking for your next Nintendo 64 controller. Of course, if you did enjoy the video, please do consider subscribing to Nintendrew for all sorts of cool gaming content, and make sure to share the video with any friends who might find it interesting. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Bye! Hey guys, thanks again for checking out the video and for making it all the way to the end. Hope you enjoyed. As always, I've got links to all my social media in the description below, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Discord, that sort of thing. And if you'd like to help out even more, I've got a link to my Patreon on the right side of your screen. Otherwise, I hope you'll look out for the next video. Take care.